All right, good evening, folks. Welcome to another episode of vBrownBag, the weekly IT podcast where we hang out with professionals in the field to talk about things that they're passionate about, interesting technological topics, and basically IT nerd show and tell. This evening, we're going to get into software security. So with us this evening, we've got Renaldi Gondosubroto, and his topic is going to be how to develop, or once more into the breach. Dun, da, 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 how to develop a secure coding culture in an era of continuous threats. As we've all known in the news and on Hackerspace and Y Combinator and all and Hacker News, there's constant continuous threats. Software developers are right in the line of fire. Their APIs are getting hammered all day long, every day. And so let's change gears a little bit. We talked about secure VPN hosting last week, and this week we're going to talk about secure coding culture. So Renaldi, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here. So, hey everyone.
We're very glad to have you. Hold on. Let me get the show notes out of the way first.
Gotcha.
Folks, get in on the conversation. If you're in the audience or if you're watching this in the future, if you at vBrownBag or hashtag vBrownBag on Twitter, I will be paying attention and we will field questions to Renaldi. If you are in the studio audience, feel free to add a question to the Q&A chat or to the chat channel, and I'll be paying attention there. And we will pass the baton over to Renaldi. If you want to follow him on Twitter, I encourage you to do so. He is Renaldi G on Twitter. And I discourage you from following me. I am at Mistwire on Twitter. I say nothing good. It's just cat pictures and fluff. So, Renaldi, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here. So, hey everyone. Happy to be here. And yeah, without further ado, I'm just gonna pretty much start giving my presentation on one more breach. And yeah, it's as Chris introduced as well, it's been a very fiery topic, I'd say, these days, especially with the age of more or less the breaches we've seen in Australia itself. We've had a few really bad ones, and it's always most of these cases are always due to very small mistakes, essentially mishaps of APIs being open or code not being done securely. So pretty much just essentially had this session to more or less talk about this and more or less just encourage a discussion as well within the community as well. And yeah, get a discussion as well within the brown-bag session as well to get more folks into the discussion and think more about how we can essentially secure code better and develop better culture as well. Because at the end of the day, secure coding is not so much as a practice, but more so much as a culture that you need to cultivate over time, which then falls into the practice. So yeah, without further ado, I'll get straight into it. So just bringing us through the agenda for a bit first. So we'll be going through 5 main items. Firstly, I'll be talking you to how we can set security goals, and afterwards, what we need to be able to understand for why we need zero trust and how we can start implementing it. Afterwards, we'll start talking about how we can establish secure coding as a culture. And after that, we'll be talking about a case study based on one of my own cases. And finally, we're going to be seeing the key takeaways from this and what you can bring back to your organization or essentially your daily work as well into how you can implement these practices too. So firstly, a bit about myself. Again, I'm Renaldi, as you already know, and I'm currently a software developer at Seek Limited. And pretty much, you can also see my Twitter and LinkedIn handles as well. Feel free to follow me, but essentially been a big advocate for security in general and big advocate for the open source community in general for about 6 years now. Been talking in different conferences and events for the past 6 years and have been involved in 20 plus conferences and events at this point. And yeah, pretty much always enjoy getting more of a discussion going on with the community. And pretty much my work is mainly based on AWS, but I also touch on other project areas as well, such as project management and in general, Python coding, for example, or other programming languages such as Golang or Ruby. And pretty much in general, I'm quite interested within these areas. And yeah, that's about that myself. And so let's talk about security goals for a bit. So of course, when we start to actually look into what we want to do as part of securing our code, we need to understand how we essentially want to improve our security posture and what goals do we want to set as part of this. So one of the things that we always need to think about is, how do we essentially measure success as part of this? So this isn't the first thing per se, but it is definitely something that has to be taken into consideration as a very crucial factor, because what metrics are we using particularly for measuring these particular security goals, and if we are meeting them appropriately? So we need to understand how we essentially measure what's the definition of success and how we essentially measure success as each step. And this is how we particularly will set security goals, because we need to understand at this particular stage, we will start getting into meeting this particular standard, for example. And essentially, this is all part of setting security goals. We need to understand the KPIs that we need to measure as part of this, the metrics, and essentially celebrate the successes incrementally, because oftentimes when you start trying to establish a culture of secure coding or start to eventually get to where you want to be, you need to do it incrementally and celebrate the little successes. You've done it, for example, like within your team first, start implementing like one practice, then you start implementing multiple practice with your team. These are all incremental little milestones that you can essentially use to set your security goals. So it is all very important, essentially, that you proceed with it incrementally like this. And of course, this comes hand in hand as well with communications with executive leadership as well. And oftentimes, this may be different with cultures that are more flat, but oftentimes in more hierarchical cultures, there is a high need to communicate directly with executive leadership and directly get more buy-in around the business. So we need to be able to understand how we can communicate the message effectively and also justify risks, but at the same time, understand how we can also tweak the message for the audience as well. Who are we communicating to? Developers, senior managers, or executive leadership? What jargon do we need to use? Like, we need to understand what we can essentially communicate, how we can essentially communicate with them, and particularly understand how we can essentially be better advocates for what we want to do and convince them through the language that they actually understand. And we need to understand who the visionaries, the pragmatists, and the skepticists are. And when I say this, there will always be different roles within your organization, albeit they're not named directly, but there will always be people skeptical towards what you're trying to propose, towards change. And there's always going to be visionaries who do believe, okay, we believe that this is a good way to go. Let's go about this. So it's very important to identify who these people are and understand how you can essentially move towards and more or less convince these particular people as well, and also more or less have them also help you with your goal as well. And of course, consider talent communication as well. Who are you communicating to? Which distribution mailing lists are you using? You need to consider all of this pretty much within this particular use case. And finally, it's very important to ensure that content is very effectively put out and ensure that you are communicating the message effectively. This goes to my next point, which is essentially on training and education. So you may have already been quite familiar. You may have already been used to taking a few training courses, for example, as part of your day-to-day job. It might have been for professional development, but it is even more important when you consider putting it within the context of professional development within secure coding practices, because oftentimes best practices is not something that can be adopted that easily. Oftentimes something that you have to more or less train people to do so and get them more familiarized with what is good. Because oftentimes people are already used to a particular way of doing things that it might be hard for them to more or less understand how they can adopt things unless you actually put it to training particularly and consider more incentives particularly as part of the training process. So as part of this, many companies, and for secure coding especially, provide annual and onboarding training usually. And this is usually where your culture is particularly embedded. That's why most big organizations normally, and even when it comes to, for example, like startups as well, you usually start to have small incremental bits of security training implemented at the start as well when you onboard as well, because they're trying to get their culture through as well. So this is very important essentially when you particularly try to build towards that as well and build a culture about that. You need to particularly embed that within the annual onboarding training as well. And of course, it covers threats and mitigations for applications, so general security stuff. And ultimately, we want essentially to be able to turn devs into the first line of defense. So I'm personally a big believer of the DevSecOps culture. We implement like DevOps pretty much like within our company as well. One of the biggest things I feel that every developer needs is pretty much to be able to be oriented towards security, because at the end of the day, security is not only something that the security team should look at. Sure, they're the most important part for consulting with security and more or less understanding what you need to do as part of securing your infrastructure better. But at the same time, you're also very important to the security landscape because you're still a player in the field. And oftentimes, what we want to do is really to be able to turn devs and in general to be able to work with the different security mechanisms and how you can essentially communicate threats better as well. Devs need to be trained to be able to understand as well how you can essentially work with this different kind of situations and scenarios. And that's essentially one thing that I feel is always very important. And ultimately, within the mindset as well, we need to be able to have a security champion program, which I feel is something that is also well known within AWS in general as well. Security champion essentially in here refers to more or less having people particularly champion security practices. So more or less act as advocates, but more or less also act as advocates towards how you essentially will do security work and how you the culture you're trying to champion as well. So more or less kind of like a go-to person as well for how what practice you're trying to implement it as well, and more or less always there to guide people as well towards what you're trying to get through as well. So we want essentially for people to be able to get this through and understand more about how they can essentially champion these particular practices. And we want to ensure as well that we don't focus such more on reputation, but more on the willingness of people to actually do this. Because oftentimes, willingness actually matters more compared to reputation in this case scenario. We want to be able to ensure that people are willing to be able to be the champions of this and also be willing to actually share as well. And of course, with this, we also emphasize the big need of learning as well to be able to ensure that people actually are on board with things. So if you've been in a practitioner in the AWS space for quite some time, you're not a stranger to zero trust policies, particular or access, particularly within these particular environments and within coding culture. So I put this particularly slide as well because to highlight a bit as well on the excessive need of zero trust within organizations. So it oftentimes is very important to secure zero trust in almost every crevice, whether it be infrastructure, data, network applications, device identity. All of that is very necessary in securing these particular cultures. So the AWS has a lot of features, particularly for this, and there's a lot of ways that you can essentially implement this as well. One of them, for example, is with AWS Verified Access, for example, to access more or less corporate applications without the VPN, or pretty much more or less also understand how you can essentially also configure a proper authentication process as well without trusting that the person who actually is claiming to be them is actually them. So it's also essentially very important to highlight authentication mechanisms that are necessary, and also more or less understanding what we can actually do in order to protect our data, our infrastructure, and everything else, particularly within the network, with the zero trust policy that we will implement as well. And this is why we also have like stuff like MFA as well to more or less cooperate with our policy as well and implement practices that we need. For example, when we start to access production accounts, we need, for example, to people for escalation of privileges. So this all is very necessary. And what we really want to eventually do when we start looking into having our culture of coding framework is to essentially have a standardization of coding practices. One of the things that I've always seen from a lot of startups and a lot of early companies is that one of the biggest problems is that there is not a particular standardization of coding framework in place. Oftentimes, there is a very generic freedom that is available in terms of the teams developing different languages. And one team can develop Python, one team can develop Rust, one team can develop with Golang, and that all is good. And they usually have different cultures as well. But at the same time, it is very important that teams often have secure practices, particularly within different goals, essentially. So we need to be able to set out clear best practices that are put forward in teams and ensure that incoming developers also can take in the code well as well. Because oftentimes, one of the biggest things that as a new developer who gets in a team always comes across is the inability to understand how your structure works, where's the documentation. You need to understand what code you're working on. This all has to be pretty much put in place. So I like to think of it as a 5-step culture, pretty much, of when you standardize your coding framework. So firstly, synthesize, and after that, you go to code book creation. You go after that to code content. You then start creating a model, and finally, you start creating the outreach for, and pretty much start optimizing based on it. So within the synthesize step, you start to look into how you essentially can start working on the code and start actually more or less what practice you want to put in place, how you can essentially look into building the coding framework. And afterwards, you then move into the start of the code book creation, which is where you start more or less trying to develop the code and put it into place, essentially, where then you start more or less putting the code into the particular code books and more or less start to actually code up what you need to. You then start to create the model of like, what patterns do I want to put through? What models do you want to put through as part of this? Well, where then after that, you start to optimize based on what you already have. So it's really a culture that is quite straightforward, but oftentimes there are many cultures that have very free kind of like development cycles. But sometimes you have this step over another step, or sometimes you can actually have this check over another check. Oftentimes it's good when it's at early stage companies because it does more or less promote a lot of flexibility. At the same time as well, it often is good to have a clear way and clear culture of like where you're going to go, because oftentimes this is what more or less promotes what you want to do as part of the coding framework and how you essentially can move ahead with your code as well. So, and this comes hand in hand with documentation as well. So it's very important to have proper documentation supporting these cultures, having proper documentation that outlines the steps, what you want to do as part of this, outlines each particular code, how you want to do this, how you essentially also approach stuff like commenting code, how you essentially also look into what you want to do as well as part of the security practices part of code as well, and maybe even training practice as well. It all depends as well upon how you take your documentation as well for developers to also understand how you securely code as well. And as part of championing clean coding as well, because at the end of the day, secure coding usually is achieved much easier when you start to actually clean code as well, because people understand better what you're trying to do and don't accidentally make faults, leave open APIs and all that whatnot, essentially. So yeah, you can essentially be a champion as well by more or less just more understanding as well the need for better naming conventions as well. One of the things that I've always seen as well is when one of the biggest mistakes as well that I've seen over time is pretty much unclear naming conventions. For example, it's very important to more or less understand how you particularly name your code as well, name your functions. We have a very interesting saying within the company, which is that if you're a good developer, you won't need to comment on your code at all. Sometimes I find it a bit funny, honestly, but I do see a point in that belief, because at the end of the day, your function and your code should normally say that, but at the same time, I always don't also I also don't discourage commenting on code as well in general, because I always personally also find it like much easier to read when there's comments as well. But that's for another this discussion. But yeah, I do feel that naming is a very important thing, particularly, and having descriptions as well for when you actually have, for example, like instances within AWS as well. It's a very important thing too. So naming can also come with both in terms of AWS services when you actually use them, and also within your code as well. So one of the biggest things I always see as well is sometimes people also leave, for example, like when you actually start naming EC2s, you start naming it like EC2.1, EC2.2. Like it's very important that you actually name it properly as well, and properly put a description as well. Describing things helps the next person who actually has to access that particular instance or service to actually jump on it easier as well, and more or less understand it better too. So these kinds of stuff may seem trivial at the first glance, but more often than not, there's been a lot of different cases of people not naming it properly or leaving vague descriptions, which makes the work more confusing for the other person. And in the end, they do something that they shouldn't for the security risk, essentially. So it's a very important thing to look at. And finally, it's very important as well to work with generated resource names, and more or less like not the physical names, more or less. And it's also important as well to understand the need to commingle with enterprise architecture. Now, oftentimes, I often don't hear EA actually being brought into the security space too much, which is actually surprising. Like oftentimes within the dev space, EA actually is surprising, at least in my experience, word that is actually quite frightening, because it's almost all associated with more or less a business processes, management processes, overall structure. But there's actually bigger need than not actually to actually focus on how devs can actually commingle with enterprise architecture and actually build on AWS based on that. And because at the end of the day, EAs are more or less very hands-on as well within how you essentially architect more or less what you do within your organization, your practices, your security. This all falls in place. And of course, you do communicate with the security team as well, and within the risk management team as well, if you have any, in the case of big organizations. But at the same time, it's also, also have the big need as well to commingle with EAs as well, because you need to be able to essentially have visibility across the business of how your code repository is positioned. As the company goes bigger, usually there's an even greater need for this. I've seen over time, and there usually is a very big need of setting up proper documentation for where your code is located, who your owners are, who the code owners are, and oftentimes this all is, more often than not, it's something that has to be started at the early stages, because at the later stages it often becomes quite convoluted, and security becomes even more crucial at that point. So it is very important to cooperate with the enterprise architecture team to be able to have visibility across the business with creation of code repositories, understanding where security mechanisms are implemented in each place, and more or less architected according to best practices of solutions architecture as well, based on what you're doing. And because in the end of the day, you also need a structured way of looking through the different parts of the business. You need to understand what works with what, and how you can essentially prevent breach mechanisms, and how you can implement zero trust policies in general from the whole organization. So this always works in that way. And of course, the need of transparency is very crucial. You need to keep people updated with the culture that you're building, and more or less how you will more or less bring this particular culture through, and understand how everything works with everything. Setting patterns and documentation standards is also another very important thing. So when we start to look at this, we need to understand what measures we already have in place. So stuff like, for example, like encryption or security measures are stuff to look at. But aside from that as well, we also need to recommend documentation and patterns as well, to remind developers as well to minimize code and over commenting as well whenever necessary. So pretty much very standard stuff, pretty much. And more or less also outline the audit and logging process that it will put in place. Like, are we already properly using CloudTrail? What are our policies? How are our life cycles currently being managed as well, within more or less our logs as well? So all of this is part of the documentation that we actually need to put in place as well. We need to also create a lessons learned plan as well to discuss what has been learned and what still can be improved. So it's more or less kind of part of the agile structure as well, and pretty much kind of like a retrospective that a lot of teams particularly have as well, for example. And at the end of the day, also develop a standardized code development process in order to establish uh, more or less kind of like a structured way of how developers can work with the different standards that are already put in place, and more or less work through the code development lifecycle. And so they don't have questions on what should come after which based on if they actually change teams or not. And there is a great need as well within auditing and retrospective. We have the importance of Agile as well, as I communicated as well in the previous slide too. Agile is already often implemented within many organizations these days. And if you're working at AWS, more often than not, at least what I've seen is most teams already start working with Agile, because it's very important when you introduce a new culture, a coding culture particularly, to actually introduce Agile and more or less start like moving the feedback processes essentially into working with your the way of like how you do things and how you essentially will work with things. So this all is very important, and because you need to essentially ensure that people are on board with what you're doing and that you can continually update people with what you're doing. And you also need to have checks done also in your repos as well for at least twice a year within auditing best practices. That usually is a very important check as well, because there, more often than not, there's always outdated repos, and outdated repos is actually surprisingly like one of the biggest ways as well of how people get in to breach systems as well. And that's like one of the big no-nos as well of these kinds of systems. And of course, make good use of different uh, audit platforms. Use CloudTrail as well to support your audit as well, essentially in this case, for example, when you actually use services. But on the other side as well, you can essentially also look into using different kinds of third-party tools as well, for example, like OpsGenie as well to log your tickets as well, or different, for example, stuff from Atlassian's essentially different offerings as well to look at how you can essentially support your process as well, particularly within disaster recovery, for example, in the case that you need that, or within auditing in general, and perform retrospectives more better as well. So Amazon Inspector in this particular case is one tool that I actively highlight as well within talking about coding, secure coding culture, and within AWS best practice as well. Personally, we use it as well to utilize to find vulnerabilities across environments within the company. And yeah, in general, we use ECR as well a lot. So we actually do also run a lot of scans as well in repositories as well. So it's a very neat and handy tool that oftentimes is not to mention too much times actually within a lot of dev talks. But yeah, I do find it very useful, and pretty much it's also very good to work through different CVEs that you currently have and document accordingly on like what you need to solve, what security holes you need to like solve next, and work with developers, as I said, as the main point as well of security, to also have them responsible for security aside from only the security team as well. Because at the end of the day, it's better to have more eyes than just a pair of eyes looking at everything within your organization. So it's always great to cultivate this particular culture of learning. And of course, it's very important as well to implement the proper testing as well. So utilizing some stuff like static test analysis tools as well, and pretty much getting devs to perform the exercise as well. And yeah, there's many tools pretty much that perform this, but we essentially need devs to get on board with things and understand how they can essentially perform these particular cases as well. And yeah, conformance testing is another one as well. So pretty much we need to understand when we start performance testing, we need to ensure that we are customer centric, at least towards who our customers are, and ensure that we conform to their best practices, but at the same time also ensure that we meet the baselines of well-established best practices. And that's where tools like AWS Inspector, Amazon Inspector comes into handy. So in cases like this, it helps a lot. And helps pretty much with essentially meeting the baselines of what we need and how we can also decide what we want to actually work on next. So what are some common pitfalls? Oftentimes it actually is all often just establishes secure coding as a practice rather than a culture. So this is the thing that I feel like oftentimes a lot of organizations misunderstand. They start implementing it as a practice, they start preaching it as a practice, but at the end of the day, they don't really establish it as a culture, because a culture is something that everyone has to adopt more or less. Same with AWS environments as well. You see people still essentially storing environmental variables, your keys into like important like passcodes or keys into variables, and yeah, this often leads to a lot of breaches. But you can essentially tell them once, but you need to continue more or less establish as a culture rather than a practice, because that's more or less how you'll essentially be able to get people to also buy into it and have management also buy into it as well. And every team will, of course, usually have their own version of secure coding when you actually start implementing this. But more often than not, it is very important to have it as an enterprise-wide scale or as a company-wide scale or in general, because at least if you're an organization, because it's very important that the standards that you have are the same standards throughout the organization, because more often than not, if you don't, it will lead to a lot of questions and potential errors more likely to be opened up. And it's very important as well to understand what the most common security mistakes as well. I remember that when I first started learning about security as well, and start practicing security as well, one of the things I looked at as well always was the OWASP as well, for example, for the top 10 stuff from OWASP, and they apply pretty much like very well towards the secure coding, pretty much within more or less the AWS environment as well. So if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to check it out as well. It's very important to understand what the most common security mistakes as well, leaving open APIs, leaving it open to SQL injection, all these kinds of things pretty much are very important, particularly. And in AWS's case, for example, like naming conventions can actually either make or break you essentially based on how you shape it to help people. So oftentimes it's very important to review these kinds of things and understand how it builds up as well. And just want to talk about a small case study pretty much. So I had a particular case as well within like my own company, and one of the work I've done previously as well, particularly that we essentially were trying to more or less develop a more secure culture, particularly. So within the development of many companies, as I mentioned before, we often have the slow buildup from when you actually start as an early company, but then you start to actually have a lot of freedom. People work on what they do, you get the job done, that's about it. But eventually, as your company starts to grow, you start to eventually start to actually have to establish these particular practices. So like after a while, pretty much, we decided to like more or less establish a particular culture. We established more or less kind of like a best practices document, and more or less we started adopting kind of like the agile culture as well. So particularly from this, it's very important that this is all put in place and documented. And as part of this, we then start to actually remove the complexity within the code. We recommend documents to be put in place, as I mentioned before. And within these kinds of cases, you eventually will have happier developers, because it may be actually a pain to start actually like asking developers to write documentation, because I mean, let's be honest, most developers always usually find documentation as a pain, but oftentimes more than not, it's a necessary pain, at least in my own experience, because yes, at the end of the day, it's a very important thing to have established practices, established structure, and understand how you more or less can actually advocate for this to be put out as a better way of how you can essentially work with your code, and how you can essentially put through better security practices as well, both within your code and within it when it comes to the AWS environment as well. So oftentimes it might be a pain to start with. Developers might actually be frowning at you, but eventually it'll essentially get to a better stage as well when the culture is put in place. And yeah, you'll help a lot of people essentially as well when you onboard them, when they switch teams around. And yeah, oftentimes more often than not, and in fact, yeah, almost always, it pretty much always, yeah, makes developers happier in the end because you're really building a culture rather than practice. And yep, to wrap it up, there are three main takeaways. So help your fellow developers by being a clean and secure coder. So, and secure coding must be promoted as a culture, not a practice I mentioned before. And yep, it's very important to set defined best practices that will probably benefit your organization as well, because, well, it's you need to essentially work with how AWS advises you to best provision your EC2s, work with the different security practices, and more or less work with tools like Inspector as well to get advice as well. And more often than not, also perform audits as well. So all of this, particularly within this case scenario, always helps within creating a cleaner and secure coding culture, pretty much within your company. And yeah, pretty much that's what's essentially needed as part of actually promoting secure coding as a culture. So, yep, that's all for me. And yeah, I'll open to questions now if there are any.
It's interesting that you're doing this talk now because a lot. So every slide resonated with me very much so, because a lot of the companies and teams that I'm working with currently are going through these trials and tribulations. So as you're bringing up these different recommendations and topics, they are very salient, and it's interesting. You could literally like write those as bullet points on a whiteboard and say follow this for every project, and make sure that you know you've done your homework ahead of time. We actually had somebody on a couple of weeks ago to talk specifically about zero trust and the parameters around zero trust. So all of this is excellent stuff. I don't have any questions because I was yes-anding you the whole time. So
Gotcha. I feel like yeah, and on that note as well, I do feel it's even more imperative when you, because I feel like one of the things that trends that we saw during the pandemic as well is a lot of people started also moving towards the cloud as well, with the whole like remote working from home culture as well and all. People had to move their workloads towards the cloud, so it really is more or less something that it's becoming more and more important, because I feel like all of this is very crucial stuff for a lot of organizations that are using the cloud. It is like even more so towards people who are actually starting to enter the AWS environment, because oftentimes there's people are, yeah, as you mentioned before, experimental processes that people often try to work with, establish, and it better and yeah, it's something that essentially has to be set up like earlier than later, essentially, and understanding those best practices is key to essentially establishing it early on.
Agreed. And I've seen a lot of companies that didn't establish them early on, and then they had to do a lot of backlog work to unscrew bad practices that were firmly put in place. So yeah, all of this was excellent stuff, Renaldi.
Great to
Cool.
hear that.
All right. Well, so Paul doesn't have any questions. There's no questions in the audience. But honestly, I mean, this was all like I said, I was yes-anding it the whole time. I didn't have any. You gave tactical advice. You gave broad overall topic advice. You gave recommendations within the AWS framework on specific things to practice for. You've answered every question that I could have thought up. So bravo, well done.
Gotcha.
Cool. All right. Well, folks, thanks very much for coming this evening. And if you have any other questions for Renaldi, he had his contact information up there, so please feel free to give him a shout or ping us on the YouTube questions, and we'll funnel them over to him. And we'll get some links for some of the items that you talked about into the show notes for Inspector and frameworks and stuff like that. So job well done, Renaldi.
Will do. Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris.
Folks, y'all have a good evening, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
See ya.